Hi, I'm Leslie Meredith with ITE, and I'm here at Africa Oil Week. And we have just finished the first debate of this week. We're talking about the moral case for the elimination, basically, of fossil fuels. And I have Alex Epstein, who's the founder and president of the Center for Industrial Progress. Welcome, Alex.
Thank you for having me.
You bet. So how'd that debate go?
I thought it was good. I mean, for me, the test of a debate is, do people get to hear elaborated, conflicting views from two people who have expertise on the subject? It's not so much for one person to cream the other. So I thought we did a good job of articulating our views and addressing the other person's view and giving people a perspective on different ways of thinking so they can decide whose is better.
Okay, good. Well, I know we'll be speaking to your partner a little bit later, but tell us the view that you were representing.
So my view is that morally, given the superiority of fossil fuels in providing affordable, reliable energy, Africa needs to be using a lot more of them under a broader policy of energy competition and energy freedom. So the idea of phasing out, I think, is incredibly deadly, particularly to a continent where over 600 million people have no electricity.
Okay. And how do you see that moving forward?
Well, I think one thing I talked about is that Africa really has to stand up to the rest of the world in this regard, because there's a lot of international pressure for Africa not to do what made everyone else wealthy, which is to industrialize using fossil fuels. And that's not only what made us wealthy, but what keeps us wealthy. We're still fossil-fueled civilizations around the world. So the fact that everyone else is telling Africa, hey, don't use what actually works for us, and instead do these highly speculative experimental things that are right now costing us a lot of money and not accomplishing that much, I think that's a horrible thing. And I think Africans really need to realize that they're being duped.
Okay, why the disparity?
What disparity?
Between much of the developed world and what we see here in Africa. In some countries, there's a real difference. Why the big gap?
Well, it depends if you mean just historically today, but fundamentally I think it's the system of government, that if to the extent you have a free country that respects individual rights, that respects property rights, then you can have industry develop in a way that's extremely productive and that protects everyone. To the extent that things are controlled by dictators or tribes and there aren't rights, then you're not going to have development. Now, the reason why Africa is being singled out for mistreatment today is simply because new bad ideas are easier to push on people who are trying something for the first time. So it's kind of similar to people oppose fracking, and that's easy for them to do, but it's not easy for them to oppose oil because oil is established. So it's hard for people to really get rid of oil and gas and coal where they're established, but in places where they're not established, they can say, oh, why don't you use that solar and wind? That'll be fine for you, and we all agree in theory that's good. We're just not practicing it for ourselves, but we're happy to tell Africa to practice it and see what happens.
Right, and from your perspective, what would happen would not be a good thing.
Well, it's not just what would happen, it's what wouldn't happen. One thing I talked about today is that in 1980, China was in the same situation as sub-Saharan Africa today. You had an income of $200 in today's dollars average, much lower than sub-Saharan Africa today. But you had 1 billion people who needed and wanted to industrialize, and they went against the world and used a lot of coal, a lot of oil, and now they're at an average income of $8,000 and a life expectancy of 76. That's the kind of thing I think is necessary. Now, what's going to happen in Africa if they follow this green guidance? It's just going to be a lack of progress. And to me, that's tragic. Staying the same, particularly when you're a lot poorer than the rest of the world, when you have a really low life expectancy, that itself is a tragedy.
Absolutely. So what needs to happen to make this work?
Well, I think that two things. One is that just in principle, people need to say, we're going to figure out the best form of energy for Africans, and we're not going to just bow to what's fashionable in the rest of the world. And then two, just there are broader issues of improving the governance across the continent so that industry can develop in a way that's consistent with the rights of individuals. And that's a big project, but that's the only way to do it and to make the progress that I think most people want.
So how do you see that change in governments across numerous nations? does someone need to facilitate that? Can African nations do that on their own? How do you see that progressing?
I think there needs to be an intellectual movement. That is, people need to believe that it's right. And contrast that with what's going on right now, where Africa is basically viewed as a welfare continent. So people think, oh, how can I feel good about myself by giving charity or by buying bed nets and this kind of thing? There's not a conception that these are human beings. They should figure out, they should be able to use the same best forms of government that everyone else. So in the US and Europe, you have all these Africa efforts that have nothing to do with proper governance and freedom, and that are just focused on accepting things the way they are and then trying to give people handouts. But I think that's exactly the opposite. I have a speech, I think it's on YouTube, called The F Word. And the F word is freedom. And it talks about how no one will talk about freedom as the solution to these causes. Instead, it's easy for them to give away their money rather than say controversially, hey, a lot of these governments need to change their ways. So I'm willing to say that. I think a lot more people need to be willing to say that.
All right. Thank you. Thanks for sharing that view with us. And it's an eye-opener and a lot of food for thought here.
Thank you very much.